There's a pattern that almost every man over 60 who is frustrated with his dating life shares. And it has nothing to do with his age, his appearance, or what he has to offer. It has to do with where he's been looking, the environments he's been showing up in. The assumption, usually unexamined, that the places where he's always looked for connection are still the right places to look. They're not. And the sooner that becomes clear, the sooner everything else changes. Dating apps reward youth and visual impact above everything else. Bars and social events that revolve around alcohol tend to attract a specific demographic and a specific kind of energy, one that rarely produces the quality of connection most men at this stage are actually looking for. And the recycled social circles that many men rely on tend to recycle the same dynamics along with the same people, which is why they keep producing similar results. Meanwhile, there are environments, specific, accessible, hiding in plain sight, where the kind of woman most men over 60 would genuinely want to meet spends her time. Not performing, not filtering herself through a carefully constructed profile, not managing the impression she makes on a screen. Just living, present, engaged, herself. And almost completely invisible to men who are still looking in the wrong direction. What follows is not a strategy guide. It's an honest look at where high-value women actually are and why those places work in a way that most conventional dating contexts simply don't. The first environment worth understanding is volunteering, and specifically the kind of sustained, committed volunteering that happens inside organizations with a real mission. Food banks, environmental groups, literacy programs, community gardens, animal welfare organizations, places where people show up repeatedly, over time, because they actually care about something beyond themselves. The demographic reality here is significant. Women make up the substantial majority of volunteers in almost every category. And in the over 55 bracket, that proportion climbs further. But the numbers are almost beside the point. What matters is what the environment selects for. A woman who gives her time consistently to something that doesn't benefit her directly is telling you something about her character before she's said a single word to you. She has purpose. She shows up. She engages with the world rather than withdrawing from it. The filter is built into the environment itself, which means you're not having to figure out who someone is through a series of increasingly awkward conversations. You're watching who they are through what they actually do. And the practical texture of volunteering creates connection in a way that a dinner date or a bar conversation simply cannot. You're working alongside someone toward a shared goal. Conversation emerges naturally from shared effort rather than being manufactured to fill silence. You see how someone handles frustration, how they treat strangers, how they respond when things don't go smoothly. That's real information, the kind that takes months to get in conventional dating, and that you can gather here in an afternoon. The second environment is faith communities, and this one requires a moment of honest engagement before moving past it. Many men over 60 have a complicated relationship with organized religion. Skepticism, distance, the sense that it's not really their world. That's legitimate. But it's worth separating the theological question from the social reality. Because the social reality is this: faith communities across almost every denomination skew heavily female. In many congregations, the ratio reaches 60 to 65% women. That alone is worth paying attention to. But more importantly, these communities attract women who value something beyond themselves, who are comfortable committing to a community over time, who show up consistently and participate fully rather than drifting through. Most faith communities are genuinely welcoming to people who are exploring, questioning, or simply seeking connection without having all the answers nailed down. The conversations that happen in these spaces, in study groups, in committees, over coffee after a service, tend to have more depth than what you find in environments built around entertainment or alcohol. There's a shared orientation toward meaning that creates a different quality of engagement from the beginning. That's the where. If you want the why, what women are actually evaluating when they decide a man is worth their attention, the Forbidden Manual of Female Psychology covers exactly that. Link in the description. Solo travel and small group tours represent one of the most underused opportunities available to men in this age group, and the numbers behind it are striking enough to be worth stating plainly. Now, back to the places. The solo travel industry, particularly in the over 50 demographic, runs somewhere between 75 and 80% female participation. Women traveling alone or in small curated groups, wine country tours, cultural trips, walking holidays, learning vacations, represent an enormous concentration of exactly the kind of woman who is independent, financially stable, curious about the world, and actively creating a life she finds worth living. The environment itself does something that no date can replicate. Travel strips away pretense quickly. You find out who someone actually is when plans change, when things go wrong, when tiredness and frustration arrive and the performance becomes too expensive to maintain. A week in a small group shows you more about someone's real character than 6 months of dinner dates in familiar surroundings. And the pressure is entirely different. You're there for the experience, for the destination, for the activity. Connection is the natural byproduct of shared experience rather than the anxious goal of a structured encounter. That shift in dynamic changes everything about how people present themselves and how genuinely they connect. Book clubs and author events occupy a different kind of space, and they're worth understanding on their own terms. Women make up the vast majority of active readers of adult fiction, and book clubs in particular draw women who are interested in ideas, in perspective, in the kind of conversation that goes somewhere rather than staying safely on the surface. An author event, a library talk, a discussion panel around a book or a theme. These are environments where you're engaging minds rather than managing impressions. What you learn about someone through how they discuss a book is genuinely revealing. What moves them, what they disagree with, how they hold an argument, whether they're curious or closed. These are not things that emerge from small talk about where someone grew up or what they do for work. They're deeper indicators of who someone actually is, and they surface naturally in this context without anyone having to manufacture depth. There's also a practical elegance to these events. They're low stakes, usually inexpensive or free, and they happen regularly. You can show up without commitment, build familiarity over time, and let connection develop at its own pace, rather than forcing it into the compressed timeline of a date. Yoga, Pilates, and the broader category of mindful movement classes deserve more credit than they typically get in conversations about where men over 60 might meet someone worth meeting. The gender ratio in these classes is consistently and significantly female, often running at 70% or higher, and in gentler, age-appropriate formats, even more so. But again, the numbers are only part of the story. A woman who shows up regularly to take care of her body, who invests in her mobility and her vitality, who is actively working against the slow contraction that aging can bring, that woman has a relationship with herself that tends to show up in every other area of her life. She is not passive about her own existence. She makes choices and follows through on them. These classes also create the conditions for genuine familiarity to develop. You see the same people repeatedly in an environment that isn't about performance or impression management. Conversation happens before and after, naturally, without agenda. People are comfortable and present. It's the kind of low-pressure, repeated contact that allows real connection to form without anyone having to force it. The thread running through every one of these environments is the same. None of them are places where you show up and something happens to you. They are places where, if you show up as someone genuinely engaged with his own life, curious, present, not looking for someone to complete something that's missing, the conditions for real connection exist in a way they simply don't elsewhere. The man who walks into a volunteer shift or a travel group or a yoga class with his attention on the experience rather than on what he might get out of it is the man who becomes interesting without trying to be, who accumulates familiarity and trust over time without manufacturing it, who, when connection does develop, finds that it has a quality that the compressed, performance-driven context of conventional dating almost never produces. That quality is not about age. 60 doesn't create it, and 60 doesn't prevent it. It comes from a man who has arrived somewhere internally, who has enough going on in his own life that any individual connection is something he engages with from fullness rather than from searching, and who chooses environments that reflect that rather than environments that expose the searching. The right places are waiting. They've been waiting. The question is whether you're ready to show up in them as the right person. Subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.